Chapter 3. With Stephen trotting at her side, Frances tucked the cardboard box from the Children's Aid Society into the wagon. She was familiar with the contents of the boxes, a change of clothing, whatever the small family keepsakes, trinkets, or toys the child held dear. I think I remember my aunt and uncle, Stephen said. When I say my uncle's name to myself, I see a big mustache. It's thick and wide like a hairbrush. Frances chuckled as she led Stephen to the general store. She smiled and nodded at Mrs. Garrett and Mrs. John St. John, who stood near the doorway. Mrs. Garrett's eyebrows rose and flared. Don't tell me you've taken an orphan child in, Miss Kelly. Isn't there a rule against single parents? Or perhaps you and Johnny Mueller have finally decided. Frances interrupted. This is Stephen Grumish. I'm taking him back to New York. He has an aunt and uncle waiting for him. Mrs. St. John giggled and said to her friend, You're speaking out of turn, Mrs. Garrett, about Frances and Johnny. We haven't been hearing the sound of wedding bells, have we? Please excuse me, Frances said calmly, although she knew her face was burning. Taking Stephen's hand, she pushed past the woman and strode into the cool dimness of the store. Stephen gasped, jerking Frances to a stop. She glanced at him in surprise. He was staring fixedly at the mounds of fresh carrots, golden onions, and white turnips, tinged with purple. What are those? Stephen asked. Mr. Nash picked up a carrot, rubbed some specks of dirt from it, the already soiled apron, and handed it to Stephen. Have you ever eaten a carrot? He asked. Stephen shook his head. At home we mostly had potatoes and cabbage. At the orphanage we had bread and butter, sometimes a thick brown soup. He studied the carrot and then took a bite, jumping as it cracked in his teeth. Like it? Frances asked. Stephen munched happily. It's good. So are peppermint sticks, Mr. Nash said. From a jar on the counter he produced a small sugary stick covered with red and white stripes. Handed it to Stephen. Now let's fill your order, Miss Kelly, Mr. Nash said. What's first on the list? Frances blinked. I had a list. But plans have changed. I've agreed to escort Stephen to New York City to meet with his aunt and uncle, so I won't need to stock up on supplies. She thought a moment. I'll just need something to cook for supper tonight, breakfast tomorrow, carrots, of course, and a fryer. We can take the leftovers on the trip. And a little small jar of molasses. I think Stephen will like flapjacks. She came up with a half-dozen items, and Mr. Nash fit it all of her purchases into a string bag. I'll put it on your account, he said. Have a good trip, Miss Kelly, and a safe return. Thank you, Mr. Nash. The parcel wasn't heavy, so Frances picked it up and led Stephen out of the store and down the sidewalk to where Johnny's wagon was hitched. The wagon was... As she pulled 2 carrots from her bag and handed them to Stephen, showing him how to offer them to the horse, she heard Johnny's voice behind her. Well, well, who's this fine young man who's given a treat to my horses? Frances turned to face Johnny, but he didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Stephen. Johnny Mueller, this is Stephen Grumish, she said. Stephen came to Maxville and the Orphan Train Riders. This time Johnny didn't look at Frances with surprise. He's an orphan train rider? Then where is... He straightened and glanced around. Stephen's aunt and uncle recently arrived in the United States. When they found he'd been sent west on one of the orphan trains, they asked for him to be returned. My uncle has a huge mustache, Stephen said. He spread his hands 2 feet apart. It's this big. My, that's very impressive. Glad you have a fine uncle that would like to claim you, Johnny said. He smiled at Stephen. Would you like to pet my horses? Here, I'll hold you up. This was the Johnny Frances had known, the Johnny with whom she'd fallen in love. Smiling, she watched him reach to Stephen. Johnny was kind, gentle, playful, and Frances loved him all the more. But in a few minutes, Johnny said, It's getting late, Frances. Find the people who will take care of Stephen. I'll get your boxes of supplies from the store. The only supplies I brought are in the wagon, Frances said. He looked surprised. But you told me you needed to buy a great many things. Frances pointed to the string sack. This is all I need. I don't want bugs to get in the flour or ants in the syrup while I'm away. She looked at Johnny without smiling and said, I agreed to escort Stephen back to New York City. If you'll please lift him into the wagon, we can be on our way. Johnny, unable to move, stared at her. You're going to New York? Yes, I'll be gone close to 3 weeks, she added, not knowing why. Longer, if I decide to stay a while. Stephen, too impatient to wait for Johnny to help him, clambered up into the spokes of the nearest wagon wheel and into the bed of the wagon. He squirmed like a puppy among some of the feed sacks, finding a comfortable place in which to settle down. Frances, Johnny said, where will you stay while you're in the city? Who will look out for you? She could hear the shock and hurt in his voice. She wanted to hold him and cling to him, but anger kept her backbone stiff as the whale bones in her corset. A Miss Claudine Hunter from the Children's Aid Society will meet us at the station and reunite Stephen with his aunt and uncle. And in case you haven't noticed, I'm perfectly well capable of taking care of myself. But the church social, it's Sunday. We've always gone together. I'm sorry, Frances said. I promised Andrew I would take Stephen to his family. And she climbed up in the seat of the wagon. She said, Besides, you didn't ask me to go if you did the church social. But we've always gone together. I didn't think... Frances held her tongue, although she wished she could say, You took it for granted. I'd go with you. You took me for granted. You think I'll tag along with you after you forever, without a commitment, without a promise, without even wanting to discuss the possibility of marriage. Well, I won't. Johnny frowned. You made this decision to go to New York without talking it over with me. There's no need to talk it over with you, she said. What I decide to do with my life is up to me, and apparently no concern of yours. Fumbling with the reins as he climbed into the wagon, Johnny looked at Frances with stricken eyes. It is my concern. You're part of my life, Frances, he said. but not as much a part of it as the bitterness and anger inside you, she said. It's like a mean, vicious animal that bites and hurts, but you hug it to yourself and you won't give it up. You can't have it and me too. Nonsense, you're talking rubbish, Johnny grumbled. Am I? Frances asked. Then let's not talk of it at all. Silently they rode a mile out of Maxville to the cleared acre on which the local school and teacher's house had been built. They pulled into the yard and Johnny said, I'll take you and Stephen to the train, and when due, Frances interrupted, there's no need to. Andrew has arranged to pick us up tomorrow. Tomorrow? So soon? You have no idea when you'll be back? Frances paused, so thick at heart it was difficult to climb down from the wagon. Softly she answered, at this moment, I just don't know. She woke Stephen and let him into the house. She settled him into an armchair with an illustrated fourth-grade reader. She closed the curtain over the door to the tiny bedroom, which was scarcely large enough for a narrow bed and dresser, and changed clothes. She began a fire in the stove, adding chunks of wood until it was blazing. Next she put floured pieces of chicken in a pan to brown and simmer. When she saw that Stephen was engrossed in the reader, Frances slipped from the house and ran to the side of the school, where she dropped onto the bench, rested her head on her hands, and sobbed. The next morning, on the buggy ride to Maxville's railway station, Frances found it tiring to chat with Andrew. She let Stephen babble on about the train and the upcoming trip and her uncle's gigantic mustache. She searched the horizon for signs of a rider. Surely Johnny would come to say goodbye, wouldn't he? Cold fingers clutched her stomach as she wondered over and over whether she made the wrong decision. She had hoped for so long that Johnny would listen to her and let go of the bitterness he felt toward the Confederate captors. But the bitterness was spreading over like a sickness, affecting every part of his life and his future, their future together. Together? No, the angry words she spoke had brought their togetherness to an end. If only Johnny had stopped her and promised to put away the past and think about the future. If only he'd said, What do you hear from Megan? Andrew asked, jolting Frances away from her thoughts. Megan writes about little else than the son of one of the Browder's near neighbors, Frances said. His name's Stuart Wallace, and everything about him is perfect, according to Megan. Frances couldn't help smiling with joy, our sister, as she said that. I imagine a wedding date will be set within a year. How's little Petey? He must be growing up fast. He's no longer little Petey. He's 12 now, insists on being called Pete. He's tall and strong and has come to love farming. From the first time we first came to the Cummingses, he followed Mr. Cummings around like a puppy. It was only he applied himself at school, Frances sighed. It's hard to be Pete's sister and teacher at the same time. As they reached the outskirts of Maxville, Andrew said, we see Peg often, since she lives at St. Joe. She mentioned a few months ago that Mike had gone west looking for gold. Has he had any success? No, Frances answered, but that doesn't discourage Mike. He tried Colorado, and he's in California now. She paused. Sometimes I think that if Mike was a bird, he'd be an eagle. He soars high, ranges wide, and isn't afraid to tackle anything. Each day in the life seems to excite him, even more than the possibility of finding gold. At least he's had no misadventures, Andrew said. Oh, I didn't say that, Frances shook her head. Colorado, Mike had a run with claim jumpers who nearly cost him his life. And in California, there's the train. Stephen bounced up and down in the buggy seat and shouted in Andrew's ear, hurry, we don't want to miss it. Andrew hitched the buggy to a post near the depot and carried Frances' carpet bags and Stephen's box to one of the coach cars. Frances hopefully searched the platform for Johnny, sick at heart that he didn't come. Delaying until the conductor shouted all aboard, she mounted the steps of the railway car and hurried to the seats Andrew and Stephen had picked out. She shook hands with Andrew and thanked him for the money he'd given her for traveling expenses. Andrew said, I'll wait on the platform till the train leaves. Is there anything else you need? I need Johnny, Frances thought, but she shook her head and answered, I can't think of anything. She made sure Stephen was comfortable next to the window and sat down beside him, twisting to see out the window to both sides of the car. To her dismay, there was no sign of Johnny. It wasn't until the engineer blasted the air of his horn and the chugging engine picked up steam, tugging at the string of railway cars faster and faster out of Maxville, that Frances admitted to herself that Johnny wasn't going to come and say goodbye. I'm going to New York, she told herself. The memories and anticipation welled up in her, mingling with her loneliness for Johnny and making it hard to breathe. The train jerked and swayed. She struggled to put Johnny out of her mind so she could concentrate on giving Stephen a pleasant trip. She told him stories, explored the train with him, soothed him to sleep with his head on her lap, fed him fresh milk and apples, meat, bread, and cheese at some of the depot stops along the way, and the platforms around the depots. She often saw men wearing tardy remnants of army uniforms, both blue and gray. They're late in making their way home, she said to the conductor. He shook his head sadly as he answered, some of them no longer have homes, so they're going to wander and keep wandering, I suppose. The war's been over for more than a year. Depends on where you live, he said. Heard down in Texas they're still fighting. Frances shuddered. It was impossible to believe the hatred and cruelty caused by the war, but she knew it existed. She'd seen the dark reflection in Mike and Johnny's eyes. She brought her journal, the one Johnny had given her. It helped her record her thoughts and feelings and descriptions of what she saw and wanted to remember. Putting the story on paper softened the words that burned in her heart and made her separation from Johnny feel easier to bear. On those days they were scheduled to arrive in New Jersey, Stephen was so excited that Frances could hardly keep him in hand. He ran from one end of the car to the other, staring out the window, searching tightly clustered buildings that would mean he would soon be greeting his aunt and uncle. Frances was excited too and a little fearful. The Kelly family's life in New York City was far in the past. Would returning to the people and places she'd known be too painful? The train pulled into a large shed, which was crowded with travelers, peddlers, and people who eagerly searched the windows of each car for the faces of those they had come to meet. Then there was someone who had spotted a loved one and began shrieking and waving. Frances wrote in her journal, "There seemed to be more former soldiers at this station than at any of the others. Remnants of blue mingled with tired gray without instant. Eyes are downcast and exhausted, no longer sparking with battlefield's fear and anger. I hope and pray that these weary men are able to forgive and forget, and will soon begin to build new lives for themselves." One of the men glanced up at Frances. Their eyes met and he smiled. Remembering the drawn expression on Johnny's face when he returned from the prison camp, Frances gave no thought to proper behavior and smiled back. Stephen tugged on her arm. "There's my aunt and uncle. See, they're waving at me. I was afraid I wouldn't remember them, but I do. Frances leaned over to Stephen's shoulder and looked where he was pointing. A short, slender couple had spotted Stephen. The woman was crying and smiling at the same time. The man looked very much like Stephen, with the exception of a bushy mustache. But the couple was a plump, red-cheeked woman with brown hair that escaped in little flyaway wisps from under her black straw hat. She waved at Frances and smiled. The train gave a final jolt as it pulled to a stop. Frances managed to collect her carpet bag, hang on to Stephen, and climb down the steps to the wooden platform. Stephen, dropping his cardboard box, ran to his uncle's arms. The plump woman made her way to Frances and held out a hand. "I'm Claudine Hunter, Miss Kelly. Thank you for escorting Stephen." "It's my pleasure," Frances said. "He's a dear boy." Miss Hunter's smile widened. "You'll be lodging with me at rooms in the Children's Aid Society. Perhaps you remember our offices on Amity Street? Andrew McNair mentioned on his wire that you had been on an orphan train child yourself." "Yes, 6 years ago." Stephen rushed over and tugging on his aunt and uncle, eager for Frances to meet them. The Gromishes spoke little English, but their joy at being reunited with Stephen was obvious. Frances hugged Stephen and said goodbye. Mr. and Mrs. Gromish had found employment at a hotel in New Jersey, and they were ready to take Stephen to his new home. Miss Hunter led Frances to a buggy that was waiting for them. "It's a good thing the Gromishes arrived so soon after Stephen was sent out to be placed," Miss Hunter said. As the driver helped her climb into the back seat after Frances, she added, "If they'd come a year or two from now, it might have been impossible to locate Stephen." "Don't you keep records?" Frances asked. "Such as we can," Miss Hunter answered. "We try to keep track of the children. There's so many, so very many of them. Also, sometimes the foster parents move and don't tell us. Sometimes the placements don't work out, and instead of informing us, the foster parents will give the child to friends or relatives. We'll lose contact. Sometimes there's deaths. Sometimes the child's name will be changed, even without official adoption. And the war, of course, caused great confusion." She shook her head and sighed. This placing out program is a very difficult task." "Not as difficult as it is for the children," Frances thought, remembering the strangers she had had to face at their stop in St. Joseph. She shivered with the same chill she had felt 6 years before, when she wondered if anyone would want the Kellys, and prayed that those who did would be kind and loving. Frances and her brothers and sisters had always been close, and they clung together desperately after Ma had sent them west to new homes. It had been unbearably painful to be parted, and yet, she had to admit, Reverend Brace's placing out program seemed to be the only way to keep the children alive. To keep so many children alive. Miss Hunter continued to chatter as though unaware of Frances's silence. She had apparently changed the subject because she cocked her head like a large robin and looked at Frances as though she just asked a question. Frances blushed and said, "I'm sorry. I'm afraid I wasn't listening. I was thinking about my own orphan train ride." "Of course, dear," Miss Hunter said. She patted Frances's arms. "Will you visit your former home while you're here?" "Yes," Frances said. "There's other places I remember that I'd like to see again." "Good. You'll have this afternoon, most of tomorrow," Miss Hunter said, and looked as pleased as if she arranged the timing herself. It was early afternoon by the time that Frances had stowed her carpet bag in one of the small bedrooms in the building. "Perhaps you'll want to rest," Miss Hunter suggested, but Frances shook her head. "I want to visit my old neighborhood," she said. "Where was that?" "West 16th Street," Frances answered, remembering the row of crowded, soot-stained buildings, the constant smell of grease, spoiled cabbage, unwashed bodies. Miss Hunter bit her lip and frowned. After a pause, she said, "Please be careful. There's been an epidemic of cholera in New York, and the authorities believe it festers in the slums." Frances was offended. "Where our family lived was a poor area, no doubt about that, but slums? That's an ugly word. Are they calling the neighborhood a slum now?" Even though she was Embarrassed, Miss Hunter didn't give up. Oh, my dear Miss Kelly, I'm not trying to say it is. It's just not just the color I'm concerned about. Please arrange to return well before dark. I will, Frances Ann smiled. Don't worry about me, Miss Hunter. I've long been able to take care of myself. But Miss Hunter didn't smile. In the past few years, your old neighborhood has been taken over by criminals. Things are different now.